invitation, and thanks as ever to this group whose members have always been incredibly supportive of the 5 million on the citizens' rights issue throughout the whole of this process. So I'm Fiona Godfrey, I'm the co-chair of British in Europe, and we've worked hand in hand throughout this process with the 3 million since day one to try and secure our citizens' rights. But it's now 24 days to the official Brexit day, as we heard this morning, and we still have no idea whether the UK will leave on March 29th, on 29th of June, or some yet to be determined date a long time from now, or possibly never. Related to that, if we do leave, we don't know on what terms the UK will leave. Will it be with the withdrawal agreement? Will it be without an agreement? And that is a source of absolute concern to the 5 million citizens in the EU 27 and the EU 27 citizens living in the UK. But this isn't a surprise to us, because even though it seems to be a surprise to the great and the good who should have known better, the 3 million expected something like this because they've been living in the hostile immigration environment in the UK. And British in Europe expected something like this after our government denied 60% of us our voting rights in the referendum. We couldn't vote in it on EU citizenship, and then negotiated to strip us of key rights that we need to earn a living. So the incompetence, the lies, the failure to keep promises, we saw them all coming nearly 3 years ago. So why didn't those who were tasked with protecting our rights see them coming as well? So let's just remind ourselves once again about those promises on citizens' rights. Michel Barnier, speaking in Florence in May 2017, elucidating the principles under which he would negotiate under his mandate, said, number one, the level of protection on citizens' rights afforded under EU law must not be watered down. Brexit should not alter the nature of people's daily lives. And then Theresa May, also in Florence in September 2017, to all EU citizens who've made their lives in our country, it has been and remains one of my first goals in the negotiation to ensure that you can carry on living your lives as before. So have the UK and the EU delivered on these promises? No, nowhere close, because we have 24 days to go until Brexit, and the 5 million of us are still in limbo. So where do we go from here? Obviously, we would prefer to remain in the European Union, as that's the only way that we will keep all our existing EU rights. Perhaps the UK public voting in another referendum to remain in the EU will turn out to be our knight in shining armour at the 11th hour and 59th minute. Or perhaps Theresa May could decide that she hates free movement slightly less than the idea of going down in history as the worst Prime Minister ever who broke up the United Kingdom and destroyed its economy, and could decide to revoke the notification to leave. These are long shots, but really, who knows in this crazy Brexit world. If we leave with the withdrawal agreement, we keep some rights, key rights, such as aggregation of social security and pensions payments, and crucial coordination mechanisms. But we lose, as British in Europe, other fundamental rights, such as continuing free movement across the EU 27, recognition of professional qualifications outside our host state, and more favourable family reunification rules for spouses beyond the transition period. Losing these rights will affect our ability to live our daily lives. They'll affect our ability to continue earning a living and to keep our families together. These are not negligible losses, and they cannot be swept under the carpet as a price of doing Brexit business. It's a little-known fact, but like the 3 million, British in Europe will also be required to reapply for status in most EU 27 states under a constitutive procedure. They have the choice at the moment under Article 18.1 or Article 18.4 as to which one they decide to adopt, and most member states seem to be going down the settled status or constitutive route. It will be an application that can be refused, and vulnerable and at-risk groups of British citizens will have the same problems that Anne Law has just outlined. Furthermore, we will have the reciprocity of settled status, but we won't have the reciprocity of being able to make an application on an app. And whilst I understand and I hear all the issues that our colleagues in the UK are experiencing right now, our problem is that we will have to make the application in person in most countries, attending under-resourced immigration and communal offices that can often be a several hours drive from where we're living. Members in France, for example, are currently trying to obtain carte de séjour, which they need to be able to continue moving around the EU27 after Brexit Day in the event of a no deal. In France and in other countries, we're being told that either no appointments are being given out to British in Europe, or interview dates will be available, but sometime in 2020. So you can imagine that if we had the option of using an app to secure our settled status, we would actually be quite glad about that, even with some bugs. But no, the only option that we have is the standard route that we all know in the EU27 countries. And we also don't know yet if the EU27 countries will match the UK's decision in January to make the application free of charge or not. We're not aware that any have made a definite decision on that. But obviously, if we don't get the withdrawal agreement, the future looks far bleaker. We currently face having to deal with 27 different national immigration regimes overlaid with EU legislation for some of us, where it exists. To give you an idea, in Germany, there are currently over 140 potential third country national and mixed EU statuses that we could have in a no-deal Brexit scenario. We have different rights depending on the country we happen to end up living in, be it 2 years ago or 30 years ago. Some countries are offering quasi-EU status to the end of 2020. In others, will be third country nationals the minute the UK leaves the EU. Few guarantees are in place for UK citizens who don't have 5 years residence at the date of Brexit, and many British citizens in the EU27 will struggle to meet the stricter requirements for third country nationals on minimum income levels, health insurance and work permits for cross-border workers where such conditions are imposed. So we've had policy statements from most member states in the last couple of months, but we still have to see legislation adopted in many countries to ensure that we simply do not become illegal at midnight on the 29th of March. Even when we do see legislation adopted, it often comes hedged with uncertainty and specific clauses warning us that if the UK backtracks on any rights granted to EU27 nationals in the UK, rights granted to UK citizens in the particular host EU27 state can be overturned by a simple decree in days. Article 19 of the French Ordinance is an example of this, but there are others. So we understand why our host states might feel this way, but is it fair to penalise us for the actions of a UK government which is in no way accountable to us? So we face a lack of legislation and the ever-present threat of a repeal of protection granted in our EU 27 host states, and we recognise the principle that Elena talked about earlier, with the UK Parliament always having the option to do that as well, and we appreciate that it's an issue for the 3 million. But we're also threatened by unilateral decisions of our own UK government that endanger or remove our rights, particularly those dependent on the S1 healthcare scheme for reimbursement of healthcare and pensioners in receipt of a UK pension, which may not be operated after next year and will slowly lose value, which will also affect the ability of British in Europe to stay in their host states in certain cases. These are issues where the UK could unilaterally give us peace of mind, but so far it has chosen not to. And just to give you a brief aperçu of this, the weekend after the UK published its statement at the end of January saying that in the event of a no deal it would not guarantee to reimburse any healthcare that we got in our member states under the S1, British in Europe were inundated with emails, phone calls, tweets, Facebook posts asking for help and assistance on what this meant exactly for them and what it meant for their daily lives. And to give you, that weekend was absolutely horrific. The British in Europe volunteer team worked through it late until the night, and at one point in that weekend, I think all of us in our different countries, sitting at our different computers, were in tears because some of the stories that we were getting were absolutely appalling. We had, for example, my colleague took a call from an elderly couple in one EU member state. One of them is in the middle of chemotherapy for cancer. They were so concerned by the fact that the UK government might not reimburse their healthcare treatment that the day before they had gotten on the phone to the Dignitas clinic in Zurich and a similar clinic here in Belgium to find out what their options might be for euthanasia if their chemotherapy was not continued. So this is a really serious issue. These are the discussions that British in Europe volunteers are having with our members, and we don't know what to tell them. We do not know how we can reassure them in some cases. So what needs to happen? As Anne-Laure mentioned, we had a little bit of light last week when, for the 5 million citizens whose status is mostly affected by Brexit, the Costa Amendment in the House of Commons last week asking for the ring fencing of their rights was an enormous victory. Through intensive advocacy, the 3 million and British in Europe managed to work with Mr Costa, and the amendment received the unanimous backing of the UK Parliament to push for legally guaranteeing citizens' rights in the event of a no deal. This was a historic moment in the House of Commons. It's the first time in this entire Brexit toxic mess over the last 3 years that a Brexit amendment in the House of Commons received unanimous support, and the government was eventually forced into adopting it. So this was a big moment for the UK, and now we're asking the EU 27 to step up and do the same. So whilst we're making this request now, we appreciate that ring fencing can only be confirmed at the point where a no deal is the only option on the table, but before the Article 50 deadline. We clearly recognise that a settlement of all the issues covered by the withdrawal agreement, particularly regarding Northern Ireland, must be the priority in the negotiations to reach a deal. We're not asking for the withdrawal agreement to be reopened. What we're asking for is that rather than no deal, the parties confirm the one part of the agreement which is not controversial, or should not be controversial, and which is not a quid pro quo for anything that is. So we're asking for the citizens' rights part of the withdrawal agreement to be confirmed under Article 50 as a residual withdrawal agreement, i.e. a rump agreement if everything else fails between the EU and the UK, which would have the force of international law. And let's remember that both sides agreed from the start that people should be the first priority in the negotiations. The protection provided for citizens under the withdrawal agreement is better than any unilateral guarantees that the UK and the EU 27 can make, because key areas like healthcare and pensions have to be agreed bilaterally between the EU and the UK. So this painstakingly negotiated agreement shouldn't simply fall away in the case of a no deal. Legally, we're sure this can be done if there is the political will, but it would require the European Council to change its original negotiating guidelines or to issue a new set of directives. In its 2017 negotiating directives, the EU clearly expressed its desire for the citizens affected by Brexit to continue to live as they are doing today for the whole of their lives. The withdrawal agreement doesn't fully do that, as we've previously explained, but we're clear that at the moment it's a far better deal than any no-deal contingency plan that's on offer, and it does provide legal certainty. This is what citizens desperately need after 3 years in limbo as we teeter on the cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit. We would remind you that we called for ring fencing jointly, the 3 million and British in Europe, in our first meeting with Michel Barnier on the 28th of March 2017, and in our first meeting with DEXEU in April 2017. We were told then that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and that the intention was to reach an agreement. At the end of January, I spoke in the Petitions Committee, and we reiterated our call for ring fencing along with my colleague Monique from the 3 million. The Commission, in its response, told us on the 30th of January that it was too soon to talk about ring fencing. Last week, when we started getting in touch with Member States in response to the Costa Amendment, we were being told it's too late to talk about ring fencing because we're too far down the path of unilateral Brexit contingency deal legislation. So how did we get to the situation where at the end of January it was too soon to talk about ring fencing, and 5 weeks later it's too late to talk about ring fencing? You can imagine our anger and frustration with these responses. It's deeply cynical, and it's unworthy of the European project. If, as you insist so often, that individuals matter, show us that we matter now. It's an election year. Show some courage and put 5 million citizens at the heart of the EU project. Don't throw us on the dustbin heap of Brexit and walk away. So to answer your question, who will protect citizens' rights? It's got to be you, Miguel, Barbara, all those of you who are MEPs in this House. So I'll conclude by asking you as MEPs to go back to your member states, and not just from this group, but from every single group that sits in this House. Go back to your member states and your national leaders and insist that they agree to ring fencing in the event of a no deal. Because if individuals don't matter now to EU politicians, when will we?
Muchas gracias, Mercedes.
Buenas tardes. Yo voy a intentar primero darle las gracias a los compañeros, a Miguel y a las compañeras, por traer la voz de mi ciudad y de mi comarca